We are going to now move ahead into a panel discussion with a few of our corporate partners, after which we will then move into a few more groups of startup pitches. So let's dive right in. I'd love to welcome up the panelists. First, we have Gopal Kamath. He's a digital innovation manager at BASF, where he looks after identifying opportunities and kind of structuring the POC process between internal business partners across the company and startups. And he has focuses on analytics, AI, industrial IoT, and ag tech. Next up, we have Mike Placentia. He's the group director of new product strategy at Ryder. He's been with Ryder for the past 10 years, has held senior level roles across transportation, strategy, and development. Mike started his career at UPS as an industrial engineer and has an MBA from Harvard. And then next up, we've got Brian Reed. He's the Vice President of Global Supply Chain Optimization at Geodis. He's got over 20 years of supply chain experience across all sectors of the supply chain, including planning and forecasting, procurement, logistics, customer service, transportation, and warehousing. Prior to Geodis, Brian was the VP of Supply Chain and Transportation and Customer Service at Niagara Bottling, and he started his career in supply chain consulting with firms such as i2, which was acquired by JDA, and Accenture. So welcome, gentlemen. How are you?
Great. And yourself?
Doing well. So I provided just kind of a quick introduction for everybody, but I think what would be helpful is if we can kind of go around and each of you can talk a little bit about your projects that you have open right now at your companies, those that you're looking at, whether it's technologically focused or maybe it's more industrial or application focused. So Mike, if it's okay, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, sure thing. Thanks, Harvey. Yeah, so some projects that that we will continue to work through is one is warehouse automation. Obviously, we heard some really exciting things about some startups in the space today, and it's a continuous journey here of identifying the right technologies and vendors and optimal use cases for different robotic devices and automation within our warehouses, and really kind of through experience and POCs and pilots, really continue to refine that ROI. Outside of the warehouse, continuing to look at new technologies for resource optimization. So whether that's across the fleet, equipment, or labor itself.
Excellent. Thanks, Mike. Brian, why don't we go to you next?
Yeah, thanks, Harvey. Yeah, I think for us, it's a bit of a wide variety, and some of them are going to be similar to Mike and Gopal also. But, focusing on the IoT, we've got some proof of concepts that have gone into production and probably expanding that specifically around tracking of goods around the world in air cargo, ocean cargo, and of course over the road too. And then we've got a drone pilot / production that we've been running for inside the warehouse that I think will be continuing to expand. And of course, as COVID and other issues such as that go on throughout the world, I think health and safety has become another big focus. And I know Mike and his team is also probably focused on that too, as far as, the health and safety within the facilities. Also just health and safety has become a focus area in general. So whether it's an exoskeleton device or something like that, looking at those kind of ideas to see what we can bring to our employees.
Thanks, Brian. And Gopal?
Yeah, so touching on that safety point, it's been a big topic for us is social distancing and contact tracing for production workers. So we're looking at a number of solutions there. We're on a pilot. We're also looking at voice assistance for production and maintenance. So ways in which we can streamline that process and simplify the logging of information and the access to information in that capacity. Another area is knowledge transfer for production workers. So as some of our workers on the line go into retirement, we need to train up new workers. And so having that knowledge transfer in a simplified process through video, NLP, that's another area. And then topic a bit unrelated is just exploring quantum computing for the chemical industry.
Excellent. So I want to touch a little bit on what Brian had mentioned, kind of around the visibility space. Obviously, this is not anything that's new to the industry, let alone to kind of the development. But in your opinion, when it comes to visibility and being able to track the goods, where are some of the dark spots still? Is it in kind of the import-export space? Do you lose visibility as it's trying to move through customs? Is it particular modes? Just kind of curious to get y'all's thoughts on kind of where the industry stands and what are some of those hurdles that that the visibility still needs to overcome. So Brian, since you brought it up, I'll start with you.
Sure. Yeah, I think I'll cover two quick ideas. And one is, yeah, I think there are still dark spots. Customs can be a dark spot, just kind of depending on the type of device that you're using, and also how this customs facility and kind of the process is arranged in each of the different countries. Modes, there's obviously dark spots in modes. When you get into air cargo, it's a complete dark spot. It will forever be a dark spot as far as I'm concerned. I mean, they're not anytime soon going to let us be transmitting information from airplanes. And ocean cargo can also be a dark spot, although there's ways to get around that in some extent. You got a pretty good idea. You got loaded, and then of course you can track the vessel from that point. So I think looking at the dark spots, I think it's interesting. But I had a conversation the other day. I think one thing we're seeing in the IoT space is it's very crowded. As you said, it's not new and it's still hot and everyone wants it. And so we're seeing lots and lots of different types of IoT devices. And I think, something that'd be good for the startups is to focus on what they're good at, what differentiates them, and making sure that they let their customers know what that is. For us and our pilot, that was pre-certification with airlines. So we didn't want to have to go to each airline and get them certified. So we went with a good solution, but one of the key things was how many airlines you're certified with. But there's 100 different options out there. So if you just look at the list, it can be a bit overwhelming at times.
So it kind of seems like, the visibility solution is becoming commoditized. To your point, it is how are they starting to differentiate themselves and make it easier for their customer to implement it around the world. Mike, any follow-up comments on visibility in trucking?
Yeah, absolutely. As we build different platforms, collaboration's key, and the platform's only as good as the participation. So getting, smaller carriers and different carriers to plug in and participate is critical. And so I think we're seeing a lot of unique startups come into play that are kind of creating good API integrations that are just making it easier for smaller fleets that don't have IT departments or whatnot to integrate into some larger solutions and play a competitive role in the network.
Thanks, Mike. And Gopal, I know that one of your focuses is in the industrial IoT space. So how are you guys tackling visibility, whether it's, it could be in the manufacturing facility or it could potentially be as you're shipping product as well?
Yeah, so as far as track and trace goes, it's a topic that we've, beaten to death, and it's still a problem. So, we do have initiatives that are still ongoing in different regions to identify better opportunities to streamline that process and make it a little bit more transparent. It's not something I'm directly involved in anymore, but I know that's still ongoing. As far as IoT goes, it's always a topic for us in terms of identifying how do we, one, look at safety within the production facility. So looking at how we, connect our facilities, create cameras with, AI capabilities to understand when somebody is doing something improperly, or even looking at how we use sensors for our production equipment. So whether it's audio-based or whether it's vibration-based sensors, to think about how we look at maintenance and identify potential inconsistencies with machines before they go down, and be able to prevent that. That's another topic that we've been looking deeply into as well.
So I want to circle back to something that Mike had mentioned kind of at the beginning. When we talk about the automation priorities for each of your organizations, how have they changed as a result of COVID? And it could be physical, it could be hardware. Maybe you were looking at material handling or AMRs, and maybe because of COVID, and you had to focus on the business, and so those were deprioritized. Or maybe the reverse is true. But it could also be software related automation. So booking, scheduling, a lot of that has come to the forefront, I think, for our corporate partners and trying to figure out faster ways to transact. So I'm just curious to get everyone's thoughts and see, has COVID and the new reality shifted your priorities? And if so, anything that you can share. So Gopal, I'd love to start with you.
Yeah, so for us, COVID, obviously, as it has impacted all companies, has led to a huge influx of remote workers. And as a result, our IT systems have had to be managed differently in order to accommodate that growth in user. And so for us, one of the actual topics that we're looking at, which is not really supply chain related, but is IT support automation. So looking at how do we get end user support streamlined so that we don't have our call centers jammed up. We don't have direct calls between end users and call centers, and rather find ways to automate that using NLP chatbots, for example, which can then potentially integrate to our back end and resolve issues automatically rather than having to go through an actual human and interact that through the process. So that's a topic that is of high priority for us, and it's something that I think automation can help with substantially.
Yeah, excellent. Brian, why don't we go to you next?
Yeah, I think from an automation perspective, it's one of those categories, and as Gopal said, there's a lot of categories that have kind of gotten heightened awareness because of COVID. But I think automation for us is accelerated and gotten heightened awareness. So there's some things that we've had, that have been accelerated because of COVID, but I'd say this one, heightened awareness, right? The fewer touches from a human to a human or a human to a box, the better for transmitting of the disease. So looking at drone warehousing tools for inventory, so you don't have people walking around as much. Looking at automated robots, whether those are robots that are feeding humans or automation, completely. Those are the kind of things that we're accelerating, looking deeper into, and probably going to do more of. Versus some of the other technologies, maybe we're just accelerating. The volume isn't going to get any more, but automation is definitely one where I think the volume will increase.
Thanks, Brian. Mike?
Yeah, I think it's been accelerated. I mean, the need for automation was there before, and I think as COVID has definitely driven an increase, across other players in the industry, it's by virtue going to increase our focus as well, right? So it's just a circular effect, accelerating everybody's efforts there. But it's also bringing just kind of a new value proposition to the technology that maybe didn't exist before, just because of the people aspect, right? So you've kind of almost got an intangible value proposition and new stakeholders to the decision-making process that didn't exist before. So I'll give an example, right? I mean, I think we've seen some of these like exoskeleton devices, right, have certainly been, safety in terms of lifting and hoisting. But now if those exoskeletons can help you determine if you're 6 feet away from somebody else, there's this whole new value proposition that comes to the table that you can actually use to drive adoption of the device, or at least a pilot.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. So I'd like to ask a couple of questions next, just around how you guys operate internally. What are your internal team structures, and how do you look at approving pilots? And what are some of those steps? I mean, are you calculating the business case up front, for example, or are you guys just happy to run a lot of pilots quickly, develop the muscles, and then move on? Every corporation tackles this differently, so I'd love to learn. I'd love to share with the audience too, kind of how you guys are set up internally. Mike, why don't we go ahead and start with you and Ryder?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got a new product strategy team, and really that group's role is to focus on engaging with startups and the new technologies and business models that are available, and finding the right place where that could apply in the organization. As we start to hone in on certain strategies or find a roadmap of things we're going to be putting in place, separate product teams focused on rolling those out. So I think for pilots, what's important for us is the product or the concept, is it part of our roadmap? And more specifically, if we do the pilot and it works, is it something that we've got the capacity or focus to roll out, right? The last thing we want is to do a pilot and it's great, and then we come back to the startup and say, this isn't something we're going to be ready for for 3 years, right? And we want to be fair to them, and we want to be fair to our internal resources. So I think it's very important, regardless of how great the idea is really reflecting on, is this something that if it worked, that we'd be ready to move on in a substantial way upon completion.
Thanks, Mike. And Brian, how does your team kind of bring in new products, whether it's software or hardware?
Yeah, I think for us, we're a little bit smaller organization than some of our peers in our space. I mean, obviously it's a big space, but at least some of the peers that work with people like Plug and Play. So I think we're a do it once and do it right more of an organization versus, as you said, doing many and kind of getting that muscle going and knowing that some are going to fail and some aren't. That's probably the method I prefer. And I think we all would prefer that, but at some level, like Mike was saying, we need to make sure that what we put through the pipe actually is going to be successful, not only in the pilot, but then at the end of the pilot, be successful in the implementation. So for us, we'll spend more time up front, speaking with the startups, seeing what the business case is, if it fits our scale, because again, for some of our functions, we may be a smaller scale than others. And a lot of these AI type of tools and big data crunchers need a lot of scale to really bring in their value. So we'll look at that up front. And then of course, if passes the checks up there, then we'll go into pilot and move on into production with a successful pilot.
And just a quick follow-up to you, Brian. Whenever you're looking at these, are you thinking about a particular customer in mind that you want to roll this out with? Or are you thinking, maybe this would be good for 2 or 3 of our customers, or maybe this would be good for Geodis itself? How are you guys evaluating the end user?
Yeah, I think it depends on the scale of the solution. So the highest volume is probably specific customer or set of customers, right? So maybe it's for IBM on our 4PL side, or maybe it's just for our large e-commerce footprint in the US, right? Being affected by COVID and going crazy. We need more automation to move more things, kind of thing. We do have a little bit of a roadmap, but probably not as formalized as Mike and his team, and maybe even Gopal, as far as what we're looking for down the future. I mean, I keep my eye out for those things, and I'll probably feed it to the business, but it's not coming the other direction. The business isn't as much setting the strategy and coming to us and saying, hey, keep your eyes out for these things. It's a bit of a reverse engineer in that point.
Yeah, I just want to echo Brian's point about the do it once and do it right. I mean, everybody's got limited resources, and part of that comes with size, right? If it's too small, are you really going to get the measurements out of it? Because I think what's important is that when you finish a pilot, you've got an objective set of data that you can make decisions with after, right? And if it hits the criteria and objectively this is the right thing, it shouldn't be a hard sell afterwards. The last thing we want is we come back and, hey, this is great. We want to run a couple more. It's just a waste of everybody's time. The startups now, what they're expecting to go or no go, it's not going to be there. Internally, folks are going to be like, why did you, they're not going to take you seriously when you come back to the next one. So it's all that upfront effort and commitment. So when you come out of it, everybody's kind of got the buy-in, like if this hits these numbers, we're going to go forward. There shouldn't be a question about the data afterwards.
Yeah, I think I agree, Mike. We look at it as almost phase -1, right? It's part of the same project plan. It's part of the same process. It's just a really small first deployment, first idea. Maybe not everything quite connected yet to save some money, but then you're assuming in that project plan, it just keeps going, right?
Yeah.
Got it. Excellent. And Gopal, how did BASF approaching this?
Yeah, for us, I think we're quite different, actually. I think just because of the number of divisions that we have and the number of regions that we have that operate very independently of one another, we can't take the single path approach. We actually, in many cases, we try to start small with a pilot in a specific region with a specific division. And then based on the outcome of that particular pilot, we'll roll it out to that group and then potentially share that information across some other groups for them to understand and potentially leverage the knowledge that we obtained through that pilot and understand whether that could potentially fit into their roadmap as well. And we don't really have high level priorities or roadmaps across a lot of these different divisions in terms of digital. And so it becomes a search from my side to really identify the right internal stakeholders that are motivated to drive change and are progressive enough to dedicate resources and time to running an actual pilot and what that entails. So as an organization of our size and our distribution, it's tough to have a successful pilot get deployed across a large region, and certainly not the entire company. So we have to take a stepwise approach and take small wins and try to sell those into larger wins across larger parts of the organization. And unfortunately, you mentioned, Mike and Brian both talked about data and using that to drive decisions on commercial deployments. And for us, unfortunately, sometimes even the data isn't enough. So even if we have dollars and cents figures that can show that a certain solution saved us X amount of money or time or resources, it isn't always a sell. And so it's a problem with large companies. Of course, a lot of politics and bureaucracy, and unfortunately the data doesn't always drive the decision. So that's something I think we intend to change. And I think ideally everyone wants to change, but with a large company of our size and age, it's often difficult to change processes. So, right.
Yeah, and Gopal, a quick follow-up. How do you approach the communication side? With a startup, they're going through the process. You've defined the business case, they're hitting on their metrics, And of course, things can happen. But what's your methodology for just keeping that line of communication open?
Yeah. So, I've worked with startups and in startups before, so I understand that mentality, and I also understand the corporate side. So for me, I try to strike a balance there, and I try to empathize. It's sometimes hard for people within our organization who've only been with BASF their entire career to understand the perspective of an external startup and the limited resources and time that they have. And so I try to always communicate that back to the startups that, look, I want you to understand our process. It's not clear, and it's not guaranteed, and it's not simple. So it requires patience, it requires agility. And unfortunately, sometimes no matter how well you do things, it's not going to work out. And there are a number of factors for that. So I try to be as transparent with them as I can be. So even if there's something that I can communicate to them to give them a little heads up that things might not work out as we expected, I will do that. So it's really about being very transparent throughout the process, and I can't always control the process. So it's just, I can try to be the best partner I can to the startups by being as close and honest with them as possible.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, gentlemen. We're out of time here, but I thought it was a great conversation. And to all the folks in the audience, if you'd like to connect with Brian, Michael, or Gopal, you can find us in the networking session at the end of the presentations today. So thanks again, guys.
Thanks, Harvey.
Thanks, Harvey.